Tonight, the administration's immigration crackdown now expanding and including people who are here legally. We'll explain this latest move by the White House and why people are already fighting it before it even kicks in. Then you'll meet a former white supremacist who now battles against hate. And also part 2 of our special report on the legalization of recreational marijuana. Tonight we'll look at how much money is raked in by both the dispensary and the town it serves, plus where all that money will be spent. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman, in tonight for Richard French. We begin with the administration's latest controversial move on immigration, including legal immigration. The White House announcing its latest crackdown on immigration. This time, the sweeping new changes targeting immigrants legally in the U.S.
Throughout our history, self-reliance has been a core principle in America.
Starting in October, the Trump administration's new public charge rule would make it harder for immigrants who receive or even qualify to receive certain government benefits like Medicaid, food stamps, or government housing assistance to receive a green card.
Which will now screen more effectively for the possibility that people may become dependent on the government in the future.
Acting Director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Ken Cuccinelli, explained the rule has been around for some time, but will now have a more meaningful effect.
Is that sentiment, give us your tired, your poor, still operative in the United States?
Well, I'm certainly not prepared to take anything down off the Statue of Liberty.
More than 500,000 people annually apply for green cards, and now the large majority are at risk of being denied under these new standards. The new regulations will not apply to asylum seekers or refugees. The Attorneys General of California and New York, along with immigration advocacy groups, have already vowed to sue. Several 2020 Democratic candidates like Julian Castro say this unfairly targets lower-income immigrants, particularly of color.
It's one consistent show of a president who is a racist and basically wants a whiter, wealthier nation.
The president was asked about the new immigration rules this morning, and he, of course, defended them.
I don't think it's fair to have the American taxpayer paying for people that come into the United States. I am tired of seeing our taxpayer paying for people that come into the country and immediately go on to welfare and various other things.
Let's just slow things down for 1 second. In the piece, you heard from Ken Cuccinelli, who said he didn't want to take it down anything off the Statue of Liberty, give us you're tired, you're poor. But in a radio interview, he had this to say.
Would you also agree that Emma Lazarus's words etched on the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your poor, are also part of the American ethos?
They certainly are. Give me your tired and your poor who can stand on their own 2 feet and who will not become a public charge.
Don't think that's what it says at the Statue of Liberty. For more, return to Sophia Tesfaye. She's Salon's deputy politics editor. Sophia, you recently wrote about President Trump's approach on immigration and immigrants and noted that these new policies, well, you wrote, his base loves the cruelty and that the policies are inhumane and damaging, but that's the point. What did you mean by that?
I think that this is a deliberate campaign strategy on the part of the president and his campaign apparatus, including senior White House advisor Stephen Miller, who has long sought these type of restrictive policies on both legal and illegal immigration. When Donald Trump first announced his run for the White House in 2015, he didn't disassociate legal immigration from illegal immigration. He said very explicitly that Mexico was sending its worst rapists and drug dealers, if you recall. And I think a lot of people in the media at the time and some of his supporters, assumed that to mean illegal immigrants. But as we've seen with the policies coming out of the White House, this attitude of anti-immigrant and more restrictive policy seems to apply to legal immigrants just as much as it has applied to undocumented immigrants.
What do you think is the broader takeaway from their push to reduce legal immigration? What do you think this White House is after?
I think it's trying to remake American society, essentially, more in an image that existed prior to 50 years ago. I think the new wave of immigration from countries that are not European, Asian countries and African countries and South American countries, is not favored by some in this White House. And so I think this new clampdown, the crackdown on illegal immigration, specifically on bases of income and education seem to be particularly impacting those communities. And so I think ultimately the goal is to make sure that demographic changes don't lead to electoral changes in this country. I think there's a misnomer that more immigrants of a certain variety will not support the Republican Party, and I don't think that's necessarily borne out by evidence. But I do think that that is a guiding principle in how policy has been written.
So you think their focus is more electoral and political about future elections and making sure there aren't more Democrats coming into the country, as opposed to just a gut level hatred or dislike of immigrants or people of color?
I think that is probably more of the primary driver than just some kind of general racism. I do think that this fear is unfounded, however, I do want to repeat. I don't think there's evidence that shows that recent legal immigrants are more likely to vote for Democrats. But ultimately, I'm not sure how much it matters what the motivation is. I do think that the outcome remains the same, and that is newer immigrants are being excluded and will continue to be so under this administration.
You mentioned the focus on income. That speaks to the public charge rule, denying entry to anyone who would be or just could be a burden on society. I was surprised how well that seemed to be playing. A lot of people who don't like our border and immigration policies seem to like this. It's easy to digest. We've got citizens who need help, and so allowing immigrants who need help to enter the country means less to go around. How would you counter that argument, and is that a winnable position among the general public?
I think it's a heavy lift. You'd be going against decades of misinformation that says immigrants are a drain on society. You'd have to then point out that immigrants indeed work. Both undocumented immigrants and legal green card holders obviously do work in this country. They do pay payroll taxes. They do contribute to our economy. And I think that's one effective way, I think, is for the business community, who has curiously been left out of enforcement policy under this administration, to speak out forcefully on this issue. H-1B visas, for instance, those high-skilled immigrants are being hired by companies and have gone on to do massively impressive things for this nation and the world. And I think they would have to speak out. Their employers would have to speak out. And it's a disinformation campaign. And so, like with anything else that, a lot of people are misinformed about, it's going to take a re-education.
These rule changes also mean that fewer legal immigrants are likely to seek public assistance. Let me ask you the cold-hearted question. Why should it matter to me or to other citizens if immigrants stop applying for or are prevented from applying for welfare or food stamps or even Obamacare?
I think ultimately it's because it will cost us more in the long run. Like under the Affordable Care Act, under Obamacare, the premise is that if there is access to health care and health insurance, then there'll be preventative steps before the emergency room, which is the most costly option. It's the same notion. The law enforcement community, I think, would also say that this is one of those moves that will push people back into the shadows, legal or not. And that's not helpful for communities trying to run effectively. I think the concern that immigrants are a drain economically to the taxpayer is unfounded. And so ultimately, I'm just going to have to say there's no actual bearing to that premise.
Sophia, you mentioned the recent ICE raid in Mississippi. ICE is defending its actions despite both the trauma inflicted on so many kids and that so many of the people they picked up were returned. They actually had the right to be here. I'm curious your thoughts about the raid, but also, as you touched on as well, the fact that nobody with the company was charged or penalized.
Yeah, interestingly enough, it's not just that one case that we saw last week where over 650 ICE agents, I believe, were flown into the state of Mississippi and were able to detain 680, almost 700 food factory workers, half of whom were then subsequently released within 2 days. What's interesting about that is that no one that day or that week or in the week since from those companies, the executives and the bosses have not been arrested. There was a Syracuse study out for 2018, I believe, that showed of all employers found in violation of immigration enforcement laws, only 11 were held responsible. And so that shows to me that there is a huge chasm between enforcement of immigration laws for the workers, those who have come into this country seeking opportunity, and the executives and employers who are exploiting our laws and who are essentially getting rich off of the backs of not only undocumented immigrants, but also U.S. citizens who are not taking up these jobs because, for a lack of a better term, they don't pay well enough. And if there was correct enforcement, then these companies would be forced to pay a fair wage.
You mentioned earlier that you think the president's motivation here is political for preventing future Democrats from coming into the country. I'm curious, why do you think his base eats up both the anti-immigrant rhetoric and the displays of cruel behavior towards immigrants? What's the attraction for his base?
I think it's a new phenomenon, I will say. I don't think this is something that has been in existence with Republican Party voters writ large. If you look at polling on this issue, for instance, on the wall, something that is still not supported by a majority of American voters, it has shown increased support with Trump voters in particular ever since he brought it up. And I think a lot of the appeal with almost all of these anti-immigrant policies is an appeal that's unique to Trump, Donald Trump, the president himself. And I think it's this idea that he's fighting for the people and he is doing things that are unpopular. And I think so long as he continues to be, forceful and obstinate in his position, then I think that, secures support. I don't think as much as like these are cruel people who enjoy cruel actions, right? I'm not trying to ascribe hateful intent onto masses of voters. What I do think is that they can watch children crying and more easily kind of pass that aside as well. It doesn't matter because Trump is ultimately fighting for us. And so this us versus them narrative has been something that the White House has continued to perpetrate over, various different policies, not just immigration, but I think with immigration in particular, it's pretty forceful because it's very simple to see, America and American citizens as looking as one type of people, and then, immigrants, especially those who are undocumented, as being a different group. And so this us versus them narrative is not something new or unique to America. It's a very simple and I would say lazy catch-all.
Sophia Tesfaye is an editor with Salon who has been writing about immigration issues. Sophia, great stuff. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And up next, we go from one fascinating interview to another. We're going to introduce you to a reformed white supremacist who's now an advocate fighting hate.